Hello, good people of the internet. I am John Crump, and this is Flying Rich himself. God, you got a lot of boxes back there, dude.
Don't look at them.
Okay. All right. We're going to be talking about what just happened today out of DC. DC is kind of a liberal place, and it's a stone throw away from where I live at. We are going to be talking about the challenge to the magazine ban. If DC bans magazines holding more than 10 rounds, that went up to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Most Court of Appeals are like segmented by numbers. Like you get the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. DC has their own Court of Appeals. It is so it's basically is the United States Court of Appeals. The case is Hansen versus DC. What Andrew Hansen was doing was challenging the ban on magazines holding more than 10 rounds in DC. DC calls these magazines high capacity magazines. We would call them standard capacity magazines because almost everything holds more than 10 rounds. So this was argued in front of a 3-judge panel. And yeah, we can get into it. But there was quite a good rebuttal here, a dissent. Let me just give you the TLDR. Basically, they said that that magazine bans are okay because of unprecedented societal concerns and dramatic technological changes, which is stupid, but
I mean, do they not allow people to throw a handful of rocks? You can only throw one rock at a time?
Yeah, we're just going to go through a little bit of it. I will say that one of the judges felt so strongly, he wrote a dissent that was longer than the actual decision.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so we're not going to read the whole entire thing because it's 100 pages and that would be a lot. So we're just going to skip through a little bit of it. And so let me go ahead and share it. Rich, of course, is my reader.
Unless Dark joins, because Dark may join.
He's not joining.
Oh, okay.
He called and said, what's going on? Let me just blow this up a little bit. I'm going to... Actually, hold on. I got this one better over here. Let me share this tab instead. All right. Okay, go ahead. Start.
Oh, I am somewhere else. Did you add this or did I click cancel? Hold on. All right. Sorry. I clicked it out. After prohibition on possession of usable handguns in the home was held to violate the Second Amendment in Heller, the District of Columbia enacted the Firearms Registration Amendment Act of 2008. The act makes it a felony to possess a magazine capable of holding more than 10 rounds. Appellants wish to possess magazines containing up to 17 bullets, for which efficiency's sake will refer to as an extra large capacity magazine, ELCM.
I love how they changed it from large capacity magazine to extra large.
Or standard capacity if you have a Glock 17.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, this is going to look through the standard review. The most important thing is the likelihood to succeed on the merits of the case.
To assess the merits of Hansen's request for a preliminary injunction, we must determine whether the district's
Magazine ban cap of 10,
but not to 17 rounds likely violates Hansen's Second Amendment rights. Bruin established a two-step test for making that determination. First, we consider whether the Second Amendment's plain text covers possession of an ELCM. If it does, then we must determine whether the magazine cap is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation and therefore constitutional. All right, they got that right. Plaintiff bears the burden of proof at the first step, whereas the government bears the burden of proof on the second step. Under governing precedent, Bruin Step 1 encompasses two more precise questions. Do ELCMs constitute bearable arms? Heller, blah, and
yeah.
if so, ELCMs in common use.
Okay, so you got to see if they consist of bearable arms. There's been some weird cases, like there was a judge in California that ruled switchblades are not bearable arms, and they're not in common use because for self-defense, they always throw that in there, even though that's not what it says. And so that's what.
Yeah. On the current record, we think
basically they came to the conclusion. This is long, so I'm going to skip through a lot.
Okay, yeah. The Supreme Court in Heller
came to the conclusion that yes, they are. So they're protected by the plain text. The E stands for extra large.
So should I read this? Or?
Yeah, read this.
The Supreme Court in Heller did not hold, however, that the Second Amendment protection does not extend to weapons that are most useful in the military context. Rather, the court acknowledged that the Second Amendment protects those weapons that are in common use at the time, but not dangerous and unusual weapons. This means that some weapons are most useful in military service and do not receive Second Amendment protection. The court conceded this differential treatment may mean that modern developments have limited the degree of fit between the Second Amendment's prefatory cause and protected right, but was troubled by the outcome, reasoning that diminished fit could not change its interpretation of the right. In other words, the court was not saying there is no Second Amendment protection for weapons that are most useful in military service. It was explaining that some sophisticated, highly unusual military weapons may not receive protection, notwithstanding the Second Amendment predicate regarding necessity of a well-regulated militia.
No, this is where DC is going to argue that they're not in common use for self-defense.
Every Glock 17. The district argues ELCMs are not in common use for self-defense because they are rarely used to fire more than a couple of rounds in self-defense. Hansen replies that one need not fire every bullet in an ELCM in order to use it. Ding, ding, ding. Because ELCMs are in sufficiently wide circulation and given the disputed facts in the record about the role of ELCMs for self-defense, we will presume for present purposes that ELCMs can be used for self-defense accordingly, because Hansen shown it is likely that ELCMs are arms and are in common use for self-defense today. It appears on this record that the Second Amendment's plain text covers and therefore presumptively protects possession of ELCMs. See Bruin. Hansen would have us stop here, as would our dissenting colleague, arguing that under Bruin, to find an arm is in common use renders any restriction of that arm unconstitutional. As the district points out, however, Bruin itself precludes this argument. Although not party, they're disputed that handguns are weapons in common use today. for self-defense, the bulk of what follows in the court's opinion is an extended analysis of the government's proposed historical analogs. Hardly an obiter dictum?
Yeah, the dictum is like dicta is something that the court says, but it's not like binding.
Where therefore conclude that if an arm is in common use for self-defense, then it falls to the government at the second step of the Bruin analysis to show its restriction on the right to keep and bear arms is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation.
We got a super chat from Freddie Durst. Hoping that's the real Fred Durst because I love.
I hope so too.
Magazine ban in Oregon today. In Oregon today, arguments gun permits.
Unbelievable.
Yep. That is going on. So the second step of Bruin is the government has to provide historical analogs to show that the law is consistent with the text and tradition of gun regulations in the United States in the founding era. Most of us believe that is 1791, the ratification date of the Second Amendment, although some courts, including the second, weigh the ratification date of the 14th Amendment, which is 1868 during the Jim Crow era, as being equally persuasive.
You mean when they were trying to prevent certain people from having firearms to protect themselves?
Correct. Just put that out there. In Rahimi, the Supreme Court said that that a historical analog does not have to be a historical twin, but it has to bear some resemblance to it. So a lot of the laws that they try to throw out there have no resemblance to the law. Like, for example, there is the gunpowder law that gets brought up, but that was a law to prevent the storage of gunpowder in cities where they would burn down the whole fucking city.
Mhm.
Sorry, didn't even drop an F-bomb there, but they would burn down the whole city. So that is too far removed from gun regulations. So that's why that is always getting knocked down. Another law, for example, is that there was a ban on hunting on private property without the owner's express written consent. New York tried to use that in a couple cases to say, hey, we're allowed to require that signs be posted to say you have the right to carry a gun here, or it's automatically going to be considered a gun-free zone because of this hunting law. The courts have also knocked that down, saying that it is too different. All right.
Right. So we're doing historical tradition of firearm regulation in the district magazine cap, relevantly similar to tradition of regulating firearms. Blah. And all right, so we're talking about an analog, although the Supreme Court has not provided an exhaustive survey of the features that render regulations relevantly similar under the Second Amendment. Heller and McDonald point towards at least two metrics how and why the regulation burden a law-abiding citizen's right to armed self-defense, as the court explained. Analogical reasoning under the Second Amendment is neither a regulatory straitjacket nor a regulatory blank check. On the other hand, courts should not uphold every modern law that remotely resembles a historical analog, because doing so risks endorsing outliers that our ancestors would have never accepted. On the other hand, analogical reasoning requires only that the government identify a well-established and representative historical analog, not a historical twin. So even if a modern-day regulation is not a dead ringer for historical precursors, it still may be analogous enough to pass constitutional muster. Bruin, even with the guidance from Bruin, there is considerable uncertainty as to the degree of generality at which a court might properly find a relevantly similar historical analog. At the pinnacle of abstraction on a historical analog could be representative of an unbroken tradition of regulating weapons to protect communities. Conversely, one could read the history to find no American tradition of limiting ammunition capacity. We think these levels of generality are specifically exemplify, respectively, the regulatory blank check and regulatory straitjacket, against which Bruin warns. At high enough level of generality, everything is similar in infinite ways to everything else. Cleaned up, we think the appropriate level of generalization is one that assigns the regulation in question with the how and why of the historical analog. And they're mentioning Rahimi. As we explained in Bruin, appropriate analysis involves considering whether the challenged regulation is consistent with the historical principles that underpin regulatory tradition, historical analogs to the magazine cap. With this understanding in mind, we now turn to whether the preliminary.
All right, let's just go down.
Okay.
Okay, storage of gunpowder. What did I say? They always use this.
Ding, ding, ding. The district and the amicus brief states advanced various restrictions on the storage of gunpowder in the founding era as a purportedly relevant historical tradition. A modern detachable magazine is similar to a colonial or pre-founding era cache of gunpowder only insofar as it acts to limit as a limit on the firepower available to a single household. Those regulations are not relevantly similar because they were purely fire prevention measures that affected the firearm capacity only incidentally,
All right,
if
just
at
read
all.
the final line because I think this is kind of funny.
The suggestion that they limited the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms is silly. Ding, 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 ding. Is this the dissent we're reading?
All right. No.
Wow. We also agree with Hansen that the various time, place, and manner restrictions identified by the district and the amicus brief states to fail to identify relevant similar analog, they entail neither justification nor burden commensurate with those of the magazine cap.
All right, we can skip that. So it just goes through what they threw out there. All right, go to C.
The district court held that the magazine cap was consistent with an historical tradition of regulating magazine capacity based on prohibition era bans on and regulations. The comparison is somewhat helpful in documenting a history of limiting magazine capacity, at least when combined with rapid firing capabilities. The district court identified bans adopted by nearly half of all states. Some of those states also limited magazine capacity to even fewer than 10 rounds,
All right.
including.
No. I want you to look at this. What did
Hmm.
they
Hmm. Can't see it. Can't see it.
1927.
1927.
I think even if you use the 14th Amendment as the founding era, which I disagree with, 1927 is way, way,
The fudge.
way off.
Yeah. Including two that limited to a single round
Oh,
in
and here
1927.
okay, now read this about the
Thompson.
Thompson submachine
Yeah,
gun.
this is expected. This is to be expected as one of those laws were enacted largely in response to the then novel Thompson submachine gun invented in 1918. The regulation of machine guns through restrictions on capacity and automatic firing together targets a combination that renders a weapon significantly more lethal than a weapon equipped with an ELCM.
All right, read D. Oh, by the way, there was other machine guns before the Thompson submachine gun.
Finally, the district, in its amici, argue that historical restrictions on particularly dangerous weapons and on the related category of weapons particularly capable of unprecedented lethality constitute a relevantly similar tradition. Those laws are commensurate with the district's justification of its magazine cap to counter the growing use of ELCMs to facilitate crime and specifically to perpetrate mass shootings. Therefore, on the limited record before us, we agree with the district that it had identified relevant historical analog, and Hansen is not likely to succeed on the merits of its claim.
Yeah, look at this. This is another example.
1933.
1933.
Why would there be a problem with that?
Then they got to go with the Bowie knife. We did a whole podcast on the Bowie knife thing.
Yeah, the district advances as an example, which I'm not going to read.
They agree with that. So the Bowie knife they used, they said, oh, they regulated Bowie knives in 1859. Therefore, we can regulate firearms now, which I believe is too far away.
Yes.
I'll just go here.
Nevertheless, Hansen claims no historical tradition, including this one, can be relevant because weapons capable of holding or shooting more than 10 rounds without reloading have existed since the founding, and there is no historical tradition of prohibiting them or regulating the number of rounds a gun could hold. Therefore, he argues the district's magazine cap is unconstitutional. We agree there is no narrowly described tradition of banning weapons capable of holding or shooting more than 10 rounds without reloading, or, more generally, of regulating the number of rounds a gun may hold. The lack of such a tradition is to be expected, however, because firearms did not have the capacity to occasion a societal concern with mass shootings or other widespread homicidal criminal activity until dramatic technical changes vastly increase their capacity and their rapidity of firing. There simply is no relevantly similar historical analog to a modern semi-automatic handgun equipped with an ELCM.
Okay, let's take a break here. Let's talk about unprecedented societal concerns and everything else. We're going to skip all this because it's and dramatic technological changes. We're going to skip all that because that's what they're basing it on. What is interesting is in Bruin, the Supreme Court said you cannot use interest balancing to ban a firearm.
You mean they're interest balancing with which Thomas said you can't do?
Yes, they're doing interest balancing. They might be saying this is an interest balancing, but it's interest balancing.
Yes.
So it goes through all that. So, and they're saying there's no irreparable harm because magazines aren't used in self-defense, blah, 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 to balance the equities, which usually falls to the plaintiff. In this case, they're saying it falls to the state because of interest balancing. So,
because Hansen has failed to demonstrate the likelihood of success on its merits, or that he has suffered irreparable harm, and because of the balance of equities does not weigh in his favor, this order of this district court is affirmed, meaning they're not going to vacate it.
Well, it's going to give all the historical analogs and everything here. So that's everything that the plaintiffs did. And the judge that I just want to read, I'm not going to read everything. Like, look, I mean, just some of the stuff is just ridiculous that they cited. So it's just going through all the cases and everything else like that.
In support of not having a magazine ban.
Yeah. The dissent is this. The dissent is amazing. You should read through it.
You want me to read this?
Yeah.
In other words, but Major premise explained at length above. Heller held that the government cannot ban arms in common use for lawful purposes. Minor premise, undisputed by the majority. Plus 10 magazines are arms in common use for lawful purposes. Conclusion, the government cannot ban 10 plus magazines. Winner, chicken dinner.
Read
To
this.
repeat, I read Heller and its progeny to have already held that the government cannot ban an arm in common use for lawful purposes, but I also respect the good faith in which my fellow panel members have concluded otherwise. Doubt it. In their view, the validity of every ban on arms in common use is its own open question. So DC deserves the chance to show its ban is consistent with its nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Even if that is in fact an open question, DC has identified no historical tradition of any ban on an arm in common use for lawful purposes. Neither has the majority. Instead, where are we reading? The majority invents a regulatory category, restrictions on weapons particularly capable of unprecedented lethality. Then it says such restrictions are consistent with two historical analogs. I agree with the majority that the history and tradition test allows for historical analogs, less specific than, say, bans on plus 10 magazines. After all, the Second Amendment permits more than just those regulations identical to that could be found in 1791, but the history and tradition test demands a level of generality more specific to the majority's preferred category of restrictions on weapons particularly capable of unprecedented lethality. Heller never mentioned that category, even though the court was told that handguns at issue are used in an extraordinary percentage of this country's well publicized shootings, including the large majority of mass shootings. Instead, Heller set the level of generality for bannable arms at dangerous and unusual arms, arms not in common use for lawful purposes. So did the Supreme Court's subsequent cases. They confirm that the relative dangerousness of a weapon is irrelevant when the weapon belongs to a class of arms commonly used for lawful purposes.
Then he goes out. Then he goes after the Bowie knives and stuff like that, the outliers. And yeah, basically he attacks them on every stand, and his reasoning is more. It's like, read the conclusion. I think this is good.
Conclusion. Mark Twain once told a story about an evening at church. He said at the first, the sermon was so inspiring that he planned to put $400 in the collection plate. I want to give that and borrow more to give. But then his opinion of the sermon tapered off. My enthusiasm went down to $100 at that time, till finally, when the plate came around, I stole 10 cents out of it. I agree with most of what the majority says in the first 18 pages of its clear, concise, and eloquent opinion. I agree that plus 10 size magazines are likely arms within the meaning of the Second Amendment in common use for lawful purpose of self-defense and covered by the Second Amendment's plain text. I agree that a ban on plus 10 magazines is not analogous to regulations about the storage of gunpowder or the restrictions on the time, place, and manner of carrying arms, or to state laws from Prohibition era directed at machine guns. But then I part ways with a majority in two respects. First, the majority reads Heller to leave open the question of whether the government can ban an arm in common use for lawful purposes. In contrast, I read Heller to answer that question. It held that a complete prohibition of their use is invalid. Second, even assuming that the validity of those bans is an open question, the majority gets the answer wrong. DC has failed to demonstrate that its regulation is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. The majority
Yeah, you can. So he respectively. Actually, go ahead. Let's just finish it off.
The majority, contrary conclusion, depends on two types of regulation, but neither of them is analogous. The first of them, a handful of laws enacted nearly a century after the Second Amendment's ratification in two outlier states and territory, did not cover arms kept at home or carried while traveling. In addition, those laws are too little and too late to establish a historical tradition. As for the second purported analog, it is covered only unusual arms, not arms in common use for lawful purposes. So neither demonstrates a tradition of laws imposing a burden comparable to DC's complete ban on commonly possessed plus 10 magazines. Because DC law violates the right to keep and bear arms guaranteed by the Second Amendment, I would reverse the district court's decision and direct it to enter to a permanent injunction. I respectfully dissent. Well written.
Yeah. So this is probably going to go to an en banc. An en banc. They're going to ask the whole entire district court to hear it en banc. Then it might be heading up to the Supreme Court. If the en banc takes the case, because they don't have to, but if they do, and they decide that this law is a-okay, then there is going to be I think there's going to be a reckoning coming, because this smacks of interest balancing, intermediate scrutiny, in other words, which cannot stand. When will it be decided? We have no idea.
I mean, this to me is they word souped until they got something that, made their predetermined opinion okay.
Yes. Because it failed. It fails the Bruin test. It
obviously fails
the Bruin test. They admit it, but then they make a imaginary category that was never mentioned before. I do think it's telling that the dissenting judge used magazines holding more than 10 rounds, where the majority used extra large capacity magazines.
Yeah. I mean, dude, this is not an extra large capacity magazine. Now, this is a standard capacity magazine for a Glock 17. Now, if I had a 30 round magazine in a Glock 17, I would say it's a large capacity magazine for a pistol.
The fly bag by X-Tech that holds 30 rounds, and this is a standard capacity magazine for an AK. So they make up terms, basically. Yeah, they make up terms.
By the way, have you bought a definition knife today?
I have not. I've been going to pick up the Void.
Ooh, that is the co-pilot. And for all of your wonderful knife fulfillment dreams, definitionknives.com.
All right. With that, we're going to get out of here. Yeah, I got some stuff to do, and yep, it's going to be, I believe, the AR case in front of the AR case in front of the program will take out the majority, out more than just a majority of AR bans. The big courts are tired of small courts not doing what they've been told. I do believe that they are going to take I believe that they're probably going to take the Maryland case. The Maryland case dealing with ARs before any other cases. Free suppressors get 10% off the Copilot. Yeah. Oh, okay. So we're going to wrap up here. We have wit suppressors on John Crump Live today. If you get the John Crump Live, you can watch that. It's going to be interesting. I have one of theirs for our Anderson Big Build. It's built. The suppressor is for an 8.6, which is marvelous. Thank you so much for watching. We are on our way to 60,000. I believe that we'll probably hit it within the next week or so.
Oh, wow. Cool. Congratulations.
So my goal was to get there by the end of January. I mean, end of December. And I think we're going to beat that by a couple months, which is cool. And with that, we are out of there. Remember, this was not a 6-3 Supreme Court decision.